Translations of the Quran. Almost all languages spoken by Muslimin have translations of the Quran in them. Over 2,000 in Urdu, I believe. Usually, the text is printed with the translation. If the language is undeveloped, many of the Arabic words of the Quran are taken over bodily into it, for want of corresponding words in the language. Even in cultivated languages like Persian or Turkish, the introduction of religious terms from Arabic gave a body of words which were common to the whole Islamic world, and thus cemented that unity of the Muslim Brotherhood. Not the group, but not the group that we call the Muslim Brotherhood, but you know what I mean, which is typified by the Qibla, where the notion itself is new to the speakers of polished languages that are glad to borrow the Arabic word expressing that notion and all the associations connected with it. Such a word is Qibla, where the language is undeveloped. The translation is nothing more than a rough explanation of the Arabic text. The translation has neither grammatical finish nor a form which can stand independently by itself. That is what happened with the earlier Urdu translations. They were really rough explanations. The ambition of every learned Muslim is to read the Quran in Arabic. The ambition of every Muslim is to read the sounds of the Arabic text. I wish that his or her ambition were also to understand the Quran, either in Arabic or in the mother tongue or some well-developed tongue which he or she understands. Hence, the need for good and accurate translations. The translations into non-European languages known to me are Persian, Turkish, Urdu, Tamil, used by Moplas, Pashto for Afghans, Bengali, Malay, some of the languages of the Eastern Archipelago, and some of the African languages. I believe there is also a Chinese dialectical translation. The earliest Urdu translation was by Shah Abdul Qadir of Delhi, who died in 1826 of the Common Era. He has already been mentioned among the Indian commentators. Since then, numerous Urdu translations have followed, some of which have been left incomplete. Among the complete ones, much used at the time of this writing, may be mentioned those of Shah Rafi al-Din of Delhi, Shah Ashraf Ali Thanawi, and Malvi Nadir Ahmed, who died in 1912 of the Common Era. Personally, I prefer the last. The projected Urdu translation by Hakim Ahmed Shuja has not yet been published. Before the development of the modern European vernaculars, the cultivated language of Europe was Latin. A Latin translation was made for the monastery of Clugny about 1143 of the Common Era, in the 6th century of the Hijra. It was not published until 1543 of the Common Era. The place of a publication was Basel, and the publisher Debliander. This was translated into Italian, German, and Dutch. Schweiger's German translation was published at Nuremberg, Bavaria, in 1616 of the Common Era. A French translation by Du Ryer was published in Paris in 1647 of the Common Era, and a Russian one at St. Petersburg in 1776 of the Common Era. Savery's French translation appeared in 1783 of the Common Era, and Kazimierzy's French translation, which passed through several editions, first appeared in 1840 of the Common Era. The French interest in Islam, having been stimulated by French conquest in Algeria and North Africa, the Germans have followed up Schweiger with Moissan's translation in 1773 of the Common Era. Wahls in 1828 of the Common Era, and Ullmann's first edition in 1840 of the Common Era. I believe the Ahmadiyya Association of Lahore have in hand a fresh translation into German and Dutch. Meanwhile, Marachi had produced in 1689 of the Common Era a Latin version of the Quran with the Arabic text and quotations from various Arabic commentators, carefully selected and garbled so as to give the worst possible expression of Islam to Europe. Marachi was a learned man, and there is no pretense about the object he had in view, viz. To discredit Islam by an elaborate show of quotations from Muslim authorities themselves. Marachi was himself a confessor to Pope Innocent XI. His work is dedicated to the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, and he introduces it by an introductory volume containing what he calls a refutation of the Quran. The first English translation by Alexander? It's A. Ross, was but a translation of the first French translation of Du Ryer in 1647, and was published a few years after Du Ryer's. So after this, it wasn't acceptable to really translate into a language and then translate into English. It was after this, basically, English had to be straight from Arabic was the standard. George Sale's translation, that's shared on this channel, by the way. 1737 of the Common Era was based on Marachi's Latin version, and even his notes and his preliminary discourse are based mainly on Marachi. Considering that Marachi's object was to discredit Islam in the eyes of Europe, it is remarkable that Sale's translation should be looked upon as a standard translation in the English-speaking world and should pass through edition after edition, even being included in the series called the Chandas Classics and receiving the benediction of Sir E. Denison Ross. The Reverend J. M. Rodwell arranged the surahs into a rough chronological order. His translation was first published in 1861 of the Common Era, and we see that on my channel as well. Though he tries to render the idiom fairly, his notes show the mind of Christian clergyman who was more concerned to show up the book than to appreciate or expound its beauties. There were strengths to it that Sale didn't have, but, well, I've gone over that. But yeah, he could have done better. By his own words, it sounds like he could have done better. Professor E.H. Palmer's translation, first published in 1876 of the Common Era. I also share that one. Suffers from the idea that the Quran ought to be translated into colloquial language. He failed to realize the beauty and grandeur of style in the original Arabic. To him, that style was rude and rugged. We may more justifiably call his translation careless and slipshod. The amount of mischief done by these versions of non-Muslim and anti-Muslim writers has led Muslim writers to venture into the field of English translations. The first Muslim to undertake an English translation was Dr. Muhammad Abdul Hakim Khan of Patiala in 1905 of the Common Era. Mirza Hayrat of Delhi also published a translation, Delhi, 1919, of the Common Era. The commentary, which he intended to publish in a separate volume of introduction, was, as far as I know, never published. My dear friend, the late Nawab Ahmad al-Mulk Syed Hussain Balgrami of Hyderabad, Deccan translated a portion, but he did not live to complete his work. The Ahmadiyya sect has also been active in the field. Its Qadian and Juman published a version of the first Siparaha Jews in 1915 of the Common Era.